If you have your Bible, open it to 1 Kings, and you can pull out your talk notes, and we're going to jump in. But before we do, I'd like to, maybe you've seen this. It's been around a while. It's a little bit of a oldie goldie, but I'd like to start out our time with this short little clip. So watch the screen, and turn the lights off as we do this too, if you would.
I like you when you give me cookies.
You like me when I give you cookies, but you don't like me all the time?
Yeah, no.
Why?
Because I like you, only love you get cookies from me.
Oh, so only when I give you cookies do you like me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I love you.
I love you too, but I don't like you all the time.
I know you're going to find this really hard to believe, Natalie, Chad, but it's in the human heart, is it not? I do love you, but, and so we'll get into that here. We are at a point in our journey over this last year through the Old Testament, and we've arrived at a place where King David is he's the leader that God tapped for his people to create this nation through whom he would bless the whole world, the nation of Israel, and bring the scriptures and the Messiah. And they're at a place now where King David, his life is coming to an end, and he's been able to just bring together all the loose confederation of the 12 tribes, the descendants of Jacob, into a unified nation. He's been able to conquer many of the enemies that they've faced, as we've seen in the study, make Jerusalem the capital of the city. And he's reigned for 40 years, and he has set his son, and we're going to look at his story of his son's life here this morning. He set his son Solomon up for really success. In fact, his reign, Solomon's 40-year reign would be known as the golden age of Israel. He would take Israel to its zenith, its pinnacle of just wealth, of prosperity, of peace, of national and international influence, of sophistication. They would reach in terms of just the geographic size of the country, it would be as big as Israel would ever be under his leadership. In 1 Kings, the 4th chapter, and I'll put some of the verses up, some I won't, so if you have your Bibles open, you'll be flipping around a little bit. But that 4th chapter kind of gives us some restatement of how God used Solomon for his purposes and to accomplish all that I just mentioned. It says this in verse 25 of chapter 4 of 1 Kings: during Solomon's lifetime, Judah and Israel from Dan to Beersheba lived safely, each man under his own vine and fig tree. And if you remember in the course of our study, that wasn't always the case. Oftentimes they were having to hide because they were being often raided and pillaged by the Philistines. And this is a time where everyone's able to kick back under their own fig tree. Is a time of great peace and tranquility and prosperity. And while Solomon grew up a son of the King David, I think it's important for us to know that he did not grow up in a perfect household. And that's one of the lessons I think that, a little side lesson I think that we can point to this morning here, and that is that it doesn't really matter much what your upbringing was like, the less than maybe perfect home that you grew up in. God can still use you. How many of you did not grow up in a perfect home? I mean, that's not sitting with your parents. Less than perfect, the rest of you, oh wow, bless your heart, grew up in a perfect home. That's great. Happy for you, sort of. The truth is we can all identify with that to some degree. And so, lest you think if you think I grew up in a kind of a really bad situation, that it was any worse than Solomon's, consider this. His father David had 8 wives. That never works out well. It was never God's plan or intention. Solomon's mom would be one of David's wives named Bathsheba. And if you know the story, Bathsheba was actually the wife of one of his faithful protectors and soldiers and warriors. And he had slept with her, and she conceived, and to cover his tracks, ultimately, because of just the man of integrity that Bathsheba's husband was, he had to, in his very dark and twisted mind at that time, King David had him killed, arranged for him to be killed, and took Bathsheba as his wife, Solomon's mom. Solomon's oldest half-brother, Amnon, raped that is Solomon's half-sister, his half-sister as well. David really didn't do much to discipline in Amnon. And so his next oldest son, Absalom, took it upon himself and killed his half-brother, Amnon. And Absalom would go on to, now being the oldest son, want to kill his father and sought to do so. In fact, David had to run with many of his men for his life for a time as he tried to wrestle the kingdom from his own father, David, that is Absalom. And finally, David's general would kill Absalom, and that famous lament that David would have regarding his son, "Oh, my son Absalom, Absalom, would that I had died and not you." Well, this really ticked off the people who had risked their lives to beat back this attempted coup. That Absalom wanted David dead, and now he's lamenting, and so it was a mess. A hot mess. So I hope you're feeling a little better about your family dynamic. The account of Solomon, it begins in Kings with the very first verse, and we read these words if you want to look in your Bible. When David was old and well advanced in years, you know what? I forgot something. I'm going to go back to during our little break time or announcement time. I just wanted to also say that I wanted to say thank you for those of you who are going to participate this afternoon in the trunk or treat up here, and encourage you to be as delightful and pleasant as you can, as hundreds and hundreds of people make their way onto the campus bringing their kids up here. We have, I think, more trunks than we've ever had, and I really appreciate you responding. I wanted to chip in too, but Marcy and I, we just can't think of anything. And I was telling people in the office, I just can't think of what to do for a trunk. I don't know what to do. And someone said, well, I've got an idea for you. In fact, you wouldn't even need to dress up to pull this off. And so they sent me a picture of what I could do for a trunk. Oh, so you think it's funny, Blondie, huh? How about you do this one? All right. Now, back to 1 Kings. So it says here in verse 1, when David was old and well advanced in years, how old? When they took him out to the corn maze, this is how old and advanced in years he was. And the very next thing we're told here in this first chapter, it had his now current oldest son, whose name is Adonijah, and that's not right. How do you say it, Andrew? What do you mean, what am I talking about? What are you doing over there? His son, was it Adonijah? Adonijah, that's it, Adonijah. And so he is next oldest son, and he now he's old and advanced in age, his father David, and he wants to become king. And so he makes a move to establish himself as king while his father is still alive and has not gifted him with that responsibility. And you have to, and so you might naturally think, like, where would he find the audacity to do something like this while his father is still alive, when that wasn't his father's plan? And we're told that actually in that 6th verse of that first chapter, where it parenthetically inserts this: his father never disciplined him. That is his son, how do you say it again? Adonijah. He never disciplined him. Your translation might say, he never at any time displeased him, which is really important for you as parents to realize that your job isn't just to make the child perpetually happy, but to work to make them holy and disciplined and responsible. But that's not what David, in other words, David is presented to us as a passive father. We saw that when the oldest boy, Amnon, raped his half-sister. And you read on in chapter 1, you'll see that God had other ideas than Adonijah. How do you say it? Adonijah. I do this for a living, so you might expect that I would struggle like this. Did you see the corn maze? Okay, so so where Adonijah would find the audacity to do that because his dad was rather passive and he wanted to be king, but Bathsheba, Solomon's mom, the prophet Nathan, they had other ideas, and David as well, and especially and most importantly God, because it is his story, as is all of history after all. And Solomon is made successor by King David. And then if you want to jump to the second chapter, first verse, we'll stick it on the screen for you, beginning in 2:1. As the time of David's death approached, he gave this charge to his son Solomon: I'm going where everyone on earth must someday go. He says, take courage and be a man. Observe the requirements of the Lord your God and follow all his ways. Keep his decrees and commands and regulations and laws written in the law of Moses, so that you will be successful in all that you do wherever you go. It's a if-then proposition. If you do this, then the Lord will keep the promise that he made to me. He told me, if your descendants live as they should and follow me faithfully with all their heart and soul, one of them will always sit on the throne of Israel. And so the 12 tribes all rally behind Solomon as the new king. They're all on board. And if you want to, in fact, that 46th verse, if you have your Bible open, second chapter, it says the kingdom was firmly established in Solomon's hand. Everyone was on board. Skip to the third chapter, fifth verse, and where we'll pick up this account. It says, at Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, ask whatever you want to give me. So he says, your wish is my command, Solomon. Whatever you ask for, I'll give it to you. Imagine, you probably, if you're anything like me as a kid, you imagined, because I grew up with TV shows and cartoons, and there was always a genie at some point who was saying, you get 3 wishes. Imagine not a genie, but the God of all creation says, what do you want? I'll give you whatever you want. What would you ask for? I know when you drive by and you see, or you're in the store and you see the Powerball numbers, up to like $250 million, I think you know what you'd like to ask for in that moment, right? What would you ask for? Money? Long life? Perpetual youth? What would you ask for? I used to play that game as a kid, actually, quite a bit, and it often involved, some cute girl on a desert island, and that's actually kidnapping, isn't it? I mean, if she's on the island just with you, But I was 12. As an adult, maybe we think differently about it. This is a true story. A genie actually appeared to a divorcee and said to her, I'm going to give you 3 wishes, but whatever you wish for, your husband's going to get twice as much of that. 2 times whatever you wish for. And she goes, not even thinking. She says, man, I've always wanted a huge diamond ring. A cheapskate never got me one. And poof, she gets a diamond ring. And he gets 2. And then he says, what's your second wish? He says, tell you how old this actually happened, how long ago. She only asked for $1 million. I wish I had $1 million, and poof, she's got $1 million. He's got 2. She's catching on. He says, well, what's your third and last wish? She goes, I want you to scare me half to death. Some of you can explain it in the car on the way home. And so here's Solomon. What do you want? What would you like? And we read this in verse 6. Solomon answered, you have shown great kindness to your servant, my father David, because he was faithful to you and righteous and upright in heart. And you have continued this great kindness to him and have given him a son to sit on the throne this very day. And so verse 7, O Lord, my God, you have made your servant, me, your servant, king. Your servant king, a servant king in place of his father David. But I'm only a little child. He's 20 years old, but he's just saying, really, who am I for such a great honor and responsibility? He says, I'm just a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. And so verse 9 says, so give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours? Now, if this was Family Feud and he had siblings there on the game show with him, they would not be clapping, good answer, good answer. They'd say, what about the money? But God was. God was clapping. In fact, as it continues in verse 10, it says the Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. And so God said to him, since you have asked for this and not for a long life or wealth for yourself, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies, like scare me half to death. He didn't go there. He said, but instead you asked for discernment in administering justice. And so verse 12, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both riches and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among the kings. In verse 14, and if you walk in my way and obey my statutes and commands as David your father did. He didn't do it perfectly, but he had a heart after God, we're told. And he says, and I will give you a long life. And then the next verse says that he awoke and he realized that it was just a dream. But this was no ordinary dream, not at all. And in fact, the Lord had answered his request is demonstrated immediately, and as we read this account in the very next verses, where it says 2 women came to Solomon, and we're told that they're prostitutes. And both of them had newborn infants and lived in the same house. And one of the infants during the night died. And so that mother thought to swap out the living baby. And it's not hard to, in my mind anyway, to imagine. I mean, it's not a profession most people would choose, and certainly not then. I mean, these are the people at the very bottom of the ladder, people who are used and used again and wouldn't really know what it meant to be loved. And if you've ever had a newborn baby, man, it's just like you couldn't love something more. And even when they poop and puke on you, it's like, I'm down with this. And she began to experience that and lost it in a moment. And so not hard for me to imagine why she would want to swap the baby out. But if you're a mom and you've had a baby, there ain't no fooling a mama. I think fool the rest of us, because, all babies pretty much, except for these 2 up here, they look like little old men. I mean, it's hard to really, you say nice things about them and hope they'll grow into those ears and such and knows, but mama knows. And this mama knew, and so they came to Solomon, both claiming that the baby belonged to them, that they were the legitimate mother. And how was Solomon going to know? All babies look like little old men. There were no DNA tests, right? There were no witnesses. It was just she said. And so Solomon says, well, bring me a sword and we'll settle this here. We'll just give you each a half. And the real mother, and he knew this, the real mother says, please, my Lord, give her this living baby to the other woman. And the other woman, quite frankly, was down with it. I mean, it wasn't hers to begin with. And she had in her heart that ugly thing we call envy. It's sometimes kind of confused with jealousy. It's a little different. Jealousy just wants what you have. Envy resents you for having it. And misery likes company when you're an envious person. And in this decision, Solomon demonstrated that God had in fact answered his prayer to give him a wise and discerning heart. And more than that, it also demonstrates that he had a heart for people, the people that he was called to lead and administer justice to. And he did it to the people who were the lowest on the ladder, the people least likely to get any kind of justice or compassion. And he demonstrated that to the most marginalized. And she received justice that day. And then chapter 4:29, if you want to drop down to that, God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight and breadth of understanding as measureless as the sands of the seashore. In verse 31, and his fame spread to all the surrounding nations. And he spoke 3,000 proverbs. Try to come up with 3 proverbs or 5 in your lifetime. And it says that he wrote 3,000 proverbs, like the one where it says, a passerby who meddles in the affairs of others. He's like someone who grabs a stray dog by the ears. Mind your own business, in other words. Just pithy little sayings of wisdom. Or the one like, even a fool is thought wise if they keep their big fat yapper shut. He says in the original Hebrew, with their mouths shut, they seem intelligent. What is that? Someone else quipped later, something about keep quiet and you'll seem wise or something. Open your mouth, you'll remove all doubt that you're not, or something to that effect. 3,000 of them, many of them are actually recorded in the book of Proverbs in the Bible. God thought them to be so helpful and wise and insightful. And then it says he wrote over 1,000 songs. You ever tried to write a song? If you grew up in church, you probably experienced maybe what I did early in my life, especially when churches felt like anybody should have access to a mic, whether they had a gift or not, and they had something called special music. Sometimes it's special, sometimes it was not. It was special, a different kind of special. And they'd often introduce the song with, this is a song that the Lord has given me. The Lord gave me this song, you think, and after you hear it, you think, no wonder they didn't want that. And I tried to write a song once. I played the guitar for a little bit, never that, really natural at it, and tried to write a few songs, but they just I couldn't get them off the ground. I'd be like, God's a God of love, came down like a dove. I wouldn't listen, and he gave me a shove, or whatever. All I really wanted was a hug. And, it's like, I don't think that's the gift that God's given you, okay? But you'd take a run at it. But 1,000 songs, 3,000 proverbs. This man isn't just wise, he's brilliant. In fact, we're told in that 33rd verse that it's like, he's like the guy, the smartest guy in the room kind of guy, except for that he actually was. Those people, they think they know everything about everything. He did. I mean, you want to talk about botany? Go see Solomon. You want to talk about zoology? Go see Solomon. He really was the smartest guy in the room. Something that's really helped me was a birthday card that I was given by the staff, probably 20-some years ago. And it really helped me to realize that, you just don't know everything. And so I got this birthday card, and it's got a couple of older people on the front cover, and the husband's pointing towards across a lake to some treed peninsula or whatever, and he's got his wife there with him. And the front of the card says, the guy's saying, you see that land sticking out into the water, do you? And she says, yeah. He goes, well, they call that a stick out because of the way it sticks out into the water. And you open it up and it goes, another year older, another year closer to just making up crap. Do you know that guy? Don't be that guy. Solomon wasn't that guy. He actually knew what he was talking about. He was brilliant. And as you might imagine, with that kind of intelligence and that kind of wisdom came great honor and recognition and power and wealth and great glory. And so the surrounding nations became, even because of his power, would become subject to him and bring tribute. Don't thump on us and we'll pay you. That's just the way it worked back then, and works in some parts of the world even now. And so Solomon, gained so much gold and silver that it's like he doesn't even know what to do with it. In fact, if you're in chapter 10, look down in verse 20, it says the king had a fleet of trading ships. Once every 3 years, it returned carrying gold and silver and ivory and apes and baboons. I mean, they're going out, they're getting spices and gold and silver, and these ships are returning from all parts of the then known world, and they're even bringing, for Solomon's pleasure and enjoyment and interest, apes and baboons. Now, listen, when you start collecting baboons, I think you officially qualify as someone who has more money than he knows what to do with. And that was the case for Solomon. In chapter 10, verse 23, it says, and you can look at it on the screen here, King Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings of the earth. The whole world sought an audience with Solomon to hear the wisdom that God had put in his heart. And year after year, everyone who came, they brought gifts, articles of silver and gold, and the latest fashions, and everyone and weapons and spices and horses and mules. Nowadays, it would be like Jay Leno, collects cars. Horses and mules was just another thing that he collected. And then in the 4th chapter, 20, if we're going to jump back, you don't need to, but just again to kind of give us a sense of just the kind of opulence and wealth that Solomon enjoyed. We're told in the 4th chapter that the daily provisions for his household, and that would have included the 700 wives that he had collected along the way, and the 300 concubine, which was like a second-class wife. Because they were slaves, he couldn't officially be married to them, but he could have full access to them. We're talking 1,000 wives. 1,000 wives and their children, and his palace servants and the court officials and all their families. He says the daily provision, what they would eat, is listed here. 10 stall-filled cattle, 20 pasture-fed cattle, 100 sheep and goats, and that goes on to list an assortment of wild game just to kind of mix things up, and poultry, what does it say, choice fowl. And as you read that, you think, well, he's clearly not a vegetarian. I mean, there's no Brussels sprout casserole included on the list there. And of course, all of this would require a lot of money. And so the taxes were sky high. And not only that, his ambitious building projects required a lot of laborers. And so he would conscript virtually, when you're conscripted, you're slave labor. And the taxes, and the oppressive taxes and the oppressive slave labor conscriptions would at his death be really at the heart of civil unrest, and we'll get into that next week. But that's the story we're painted. It's painted for us here. And yet in the midst of all of this that he's enjoying, we're told that he was finally able to build the temple to the Lord God that his father David always dreamed of being able to, but wasn't. And Solomon was able to complete that temple in Jerusalem. And now they would have one central place to gather and worship the one true and living God. I mean, all the pagan nations around them had many gods and many places of worship. And this would be the one place to worship the one true and living God. David's dream. And if you want to read about it in chapter 5 and 6, it's quite a bit of detail about the construction of the temple and about the elaborate and magnificent furnishings that went into it. And then at the completion of that, it's like you get a glimpse into hopefully David's heart, because it's like a stellar, magnificent model prayer. And it's recorded, and I put the reference there in your talk notes, but in chapter 8 and verse 23 is where it begins, but he starts like, oh Lord, there's God, there's just no one like, we sang a song like that, right? That last of the 3 songs. There's no one like you, God. No one who keeps their promises of love like you did to my father David, like you do for everyone who continues to serve you wholeheartedly. He says, and I realize that this temple, as magnificent as it is, couldn't possibly be the dwelling place for the God that the highest heavens aren't large enough to contain. In fact, as you read that, it sounds an awful lot like David's song in the book of Songs, or Psalms 8, where he says, when I look at the heavens and I consider the works of your hands, it's overwhelming. That's what David's saying in Psalm 8 in that song. And then to ponder, a God who just speaks all of this into existence could care. I mean, how could a God like that care about just people? And yet he does. And David says it's overwhelming, and Solomon's saying, man, when I consider that, it boggles my mind as well. And then he goes on to say, hear the request of your people. As we gather here to pray to you, God, hear us. Teach us to do right. And when we don't, and when we fail, and we come to you in repentance and have a change of heart, God, have mercy on us. And then he closes with, have mercy and forgiveness, and he says, give us this desire to want to live right and do right and walk with you. And it's just a masterpiece of prayer, of humility, of commitment, of perspective. God, give us perspective. And so you look at Solomon, and he gets off really on a great start. I mean, he asks for a discerning heart so that he could give himself to leading the people in justice. God blesses him with all of this wealth. It's a time of just, what do they call it? The golden age. Time of peace and prosperity. And yet we're given along the way some hints that all is not well. In fact, it's kind of interesting here, right in the midst of all the detail from 6 and I think 8, where it's talking about the temple and how to build it and how they built it and all the elaborate furnishings, and it inserts this little detail here, kind of oddly, curiously, certainly. In the last of chapter 6, it says he spent 7 years building it. That is the temple. You can put it on the screen here because I want them to see this. He spent 7 years building it. It took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. And that may or may not mean anything, but it would be an odd place to just insert that little detail if it weren't to try to give us a little bit of a hint here that not everything was right with Solomon and his heart and his heart's devotion. Twice as long working on his palace. I think it kind of suggests to us what his higher priority was. And it isn't the first time we're given a little insight like that. Way back in that 3rd chapter, we'll put it on the screen, 3rd verse, Solomon showed his love for the Lord by walking according to the statutes of David. I mean, except, it's just a little word, except that he offered sacrifices and burnt incense on high places, which just kind of put him in a vulnerable place, because the high places were those used by the Canaanites in their religious practices, and they would build altars there on these high places thinking that got him closer to God. And we're not told here he was worshiping these false gods, but he's putting himself in a precarious place. And so he showed his love for the Lord, except for that one little flaw. It sounds small enough, really. Not that big of a deal. It doesn't sound. Just a little 2-syllable word. Except for that, except is a dangerous 2-syllable word. It's just a conjunction. It's like but. It's like he did everything but. He did everything except this little thing. And the danger with that little 2-syllable word in this context was he was just making space for the possibility of worshiping gods that aren't gods, dividing his heart's devotion with other idols and other competitors than the true and living God, of making room for compromise, for half-hearted obedience. He showed his love for the Lord except... And so you think, why are we told this about Solomon? For the same reason, we've talked about this through the course of the study, for the same reason that we're given the details of many people's success and failures along the way. And I put the verse at the top of your talk notes again, the one from 1 Corinthians 10, where it says, these things were written down in his story. It's all God's story for us who are living in the closing days of his story, before a new heaven and a new earth, before a new chapter, it says they're written for us as warnings. And so as you read this, I think, if you're going to have an open heart and you're really going to appreciate why God gave us this, then I think in light of all that we've talked about here, what if someone was describing your life? What if someone was describing my life? What might they say? He showed his love for the Lord. She showed her love for the Lord. Except for, just a little two-syllable word. A dangerous little two-syllable word. Except for with his money. He's all in. He loves God, but man, he's tight as a drum. The work of the Lord's getting none of his money. Except for that, he really does love the Lord. She loves the Lord, but weekends, except for on the weekends, they're all hers. He loves the Lord, but he sure has a lack of any concern for people who are far from God and might spend eternity away from him. She loves the Lord, except for her sex life. She loves the Lord. He loves the Lord, except for his greed. She loves the Lord, but man, can she hold a grudge. Except for her bitterness and anger issues, except for the way he gossips. He shows his love for the Lord, except for his dishonest business practices. Man, she really shows her love for the Lord. Except for, man, she's so judgmental, just a judgmental spirit. Boy, they really love for the Lord. They really love the Lord, except for that lack of love for people. They love God. It's the people they can't. Except for that. Except. I love God, except that. And in Solomon's life, like in the lives of most of the Christians that I've ever known, not all, but most, his life was not characterized with a big giant, no way. No, I refuse, I'm not going to. It was not really that. It was just, accept. And so Solomon's life is, we're told, it's characterized by being incredibly wise, incredibly bright. He built what is on some list listed as one of the ancient wonders of the world, Solomon's temple. He has a world-class collection of wealth and wives and baboons. We're told in that 10th chapter, he's got a world-class collection of horses. The 26th verse, it says, he accumulated chariots and horses that, in fact, we're given in the 4th chapter a number, 12,000. Jay Leno has got nothing on King Solomon when it comes to vehicles. And we're also told in that 10th chapter that that the king made silver as common in Jerusalem. It's just stones. Ho-hum. And more than anyone, certainly more than Joe Walsh could legitimately sing that life has been good to me so far, Solomon could say, life has been good to me so far. So the author records in 1 Kings for us, these first 11 chapters, all these impressive accomplishments. And then it tells us, though, that Solomon showed his love for the Lord, except for that dangerous little two-syllable word that is dangerous because it leads so often to an even more dangerous three-syllable word. And we'll read about it here in the 11th chapter, the first verse, where it says, King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women. He loved them. Except for that. However, he says, besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites and Ammonites and Edomites and Sidonians and Hittites, they were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. So when did the Lord tell them that? Well, that goes all the way back to the time of the Exodus. They leave 400 years of many of those in bondage and slavery in Egypt, and God's leading them to the promised land, And he's telling them explicitly, man, when you get to the promised land, don't intermarry with the people who worship these foreign gods, because that'll bleed into your own life and it'll turn your sons' hearts, because those would have been the ones in those days responsible for engaging in a marriage relationship. I mean, they might look right, might talk right, but man, spiritually they're just going a different direction, and it'll turn your heart. So it was a command, a warning. And even more to the point, back in Deuteronomy, in that 17th chapter, it says that when you enter the land, I tell you what's going to happen. You're going to want to be like the other nations. You're going to say, hey, we want a king like the other nations. Give us a king. And he says, well, when I finally do give you a king, and I listed this in your talk notes, we'll put it on the screen, in that 17th chapter, 16th verse, he'll say 3 things a king must not do. Number 1, a king must not acquire great numbers of horses. As we go through this list, think about what you know about Solomon so far. He must not acquire a great number of horses. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. And he must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. He violated all 3 of those in spades, right? Intermarrying, I can get it. The average Israelite shouldn't do that. I'll turn their heart or whatever. But, I'm the king, and it makes great diplomatic sense to intermarry with the surrounding nations, right? You've got princesses who belong to these other kingdoms. You're going to be at peace, more likely to be at peace with one another, right? It's a strategic move. I'm the king. It makes sense. 700? Well, yeah, but they were really hot. Yeah, they were really hot. And what we really discover here is his lust for women turns out is greater than his love for God. And his little 3-letter, 3-syllable, however, gave way to a 4-syllable, nevertheless. In 11:6, or continuing here, verse 2, nevertheless Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. And as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart away from other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of his father David had been. And he followed, verse 5, the Asheress, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. And so Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and he did not follow the Lord completely as David his father had done. On the east hill, in verse 7, it continues, the east hill of Jerusalem, Solomon built a high place to Chemosh, the detestable god of Moab, for Moloch, and for Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites. And he did the same for all his foreign wives. He burned incense and offered sacrifices to their gods. Solomon, why Solomon? Man, he got off to such a great start, but he got loose in the turns. And just a little loose in the turns. What could come of that? What's the worst that could happen? He showed his love for God, except, however, but always leads to nevertheless, or very often, if there isn't a change of heart. And we're told that, about these foreign gods like Ashereth. This was supposedly the wife of Baal. She was a fertility goddess. They practiced in those days something known as sympathetic magic. That is to say, you act out in your human bodies what you're hoping to get from the gods. And since she's the fertility goddess, they would have in these high places temple prostitutes and young boys and girls, young men and women who were prostitutes, and you'd sleep with them, and then of course that somehow worked the magic to get the gods to make your land fertile. Moloch is called a detestable god, and parents would actually bring their children to be burned alive on the altar to this god Moloch as a sacrifice to appease him and gain his favor. And now here's Solomon. Here's Solomon. He's all caught up in this. And how does that happen? How do people who get such a great start, people just loving God, serving God, and that, don't you know these people? Maybe you are one of those people. Maybe you're just a little loose in the turns. I mean, you're just at the except for, or nevertheless, man, I really love that. How do they end up not just at however and except, but at nevertheless? I'm walking away, man. I've seen far too many like this. How does it happen? Think about it. You have one life. It's just a short life. And so what good would it be to run in the race and not finish the last lap, not cross the finish line? The Bible tells us there are people like that. Timothy would say some people, he said they just got greedy, man. They were eager for money and not like it was their plan, but they wandered away from the faith. They just never finished well, never finished the race. And the Bible's filled with all sorts of sporting imagery, not all sorts, but much. Sporting contests like wrestle or fight or run. Like it says in Hebrews 12:1, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that's so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. The Apostle Paul would say this about his life. He would say, and I put it in your talk notes, I would consider my life worth nothing unless I use it to finish the work that God has assigned to me. I mean, I'm going to do all of this and then just kind of fall off, drop out of the race. Many of us have been through much. I don't know that anyone gets out of life without quite a bit of struggle and pain and difficulty. But what good is it if we don't finish the race like Paul said? In the 1968 Olympics, there in the marathon, there's a runner from Tanzania who had injured himself earlier in the race, and now it's been an hour since the winner of the race has crossed the finish line, and people are leaving the stadium, and there's just a couple thousand people left, and then out of nowhere comes this runner from Tanzania limping along. And afterwards, after he crossed the finish line, they asked him why he even bothered. I mean, you're the last guy across. And he said these words, my country didn't send me 7,000 miles to start this race. My country sent me here to finish this race. And God didn't redeem you from sin, hell, and death just to start this race. But he did it so that you might finish this race. Solomon turns out was not such a great example. In fact, his life ends. He falls short of the finish line. He's worshiping idols, detestable idols. But we have, as Jesus said of himself, now one greater than Solomon is here. And we're told in that book of Hebrews again in the 12th chapter, let us fix our eyes then on Jesus. You can put the verse on the screen. 12:2, you have it? I'll read it, and if you find it, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition and sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. There's a verse that I think we have on the screen, perhaps, also in that same letter, where it says, let us hold unswervingly to the hope that we profess. For he who promised is faithful, to forgive us, to show us mercy, to correct us, to help us along, so that we can all, like Paul, say, man, I would count my life like a big, giant zero if I didn't finish. And he goes on to say, let us consider how we may spur one another on to love and good deeds, man, because you're going to stumble, you're going to fall. Life is difficult. We need each other. We need Jesus most of all, and fix our eyes on him. But we need each other so that we can be reminded to fix our eyes on him. Let us not giving up meeting together, verse 25. This is the habit of some, but let us encourage one another all the more. And all the more as you see the day approaching. And he's talking about here when Jesus comes back and brings justice, sets everything right, and judgment. But also just the day approaching, your own day approaching. You just have one life, and you're tethered by what Solomon would say in Ecclesiastes, a thin silver cord, and you just don't know when. And it really doesn't matter, I don't think, do you? That you got squirrely in the turns. I mean, who hasn't? You've fallen down, maybe you've given up. You're still breathing. Finish strong, finish the race. We need one another to pull it off. And I'm going to end our time, and the band's going to come up, at least this part of it, and we're going to end with one last song that really speaks to why we need to stay in the race and why we need each other to finish strong and cross the finish line and not end up like Solomon. But there's a little clip here from, I think, a 1992 or 94, it'll say on the screen, of semifinals in the Olympics and a runner there. And I think it'll give us a little image of what we're talking about here. So,
Tom Hammond and Craig Masbach back at Olympic Stadium in Barcelona, coming up to the men's 400-meter semifinals. Here are the lane assignments. Steve Lewis in lane 3. Roberto Hernandez out quickly in 4. Now down the backstretch.
Ismael on the left of the screen is running very, very quickly. And inside of Lewis, Sunday Bada of Nigeria.
And Derek Redmond of Great Britain has pulled up with an injury. Redmond is out.
Derek Redmond, the British record holder, and an important member of that British 4x400 meter relay team, as he doesn't want anybody to help him.
It'll be Lewis to win in 44.50.
Look at this. He's going to try to finish his semifinal race. The British have a certain tradition of running, which you have to respect.
A bizarre finish to this first semifinal in the men's 400 meters. Derek Redmond of Great Britain pulled up with an injury halfway down the backstretch. He's fighting off those trying to help him to finish the race in his lane. And now the pain too much. Swelling throughout Olympic Stadium as Redmond, with assistance this time, approaches the finish line he had wanted so desperately to reach. That is the Olympic spirit.
the race isn't over. Run with perseverance. God bless you guys. Pick it up next week.